The summer sun hung low in the sky as I knelt among the garden beds, my fingers digging into the soft soil. The quiet of the afternoon had settled over the neighborhood, broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird or the distant hum of a lawnmower. Gardening had always been a peaceful escape for me, a way to lose myself in the rhythm of nature, but today I felt unsettled, my mind drifting to thoughts that I couldn't quite shake. I hadn't expected to see David today. My neighbor rarely showed up unannounced, and yet there he was, standing just beyond the fence, watching me with an intensity one could feel even with my back turned to him. "Need any help with that?" His voice broke the silence, deep and rich with that casual warmth that always put me on edge. I turned, wiping the sweat from my brow, and smiled. "No, I've got it, but thanks." David leaned against the fence, his dark eyes fixed on me in a way that made my skin tingle. He was younger than me, just by a few years, but there was something about the way he carried himself. Confidence, maybe, or just that quiet, assured presence that always lingered between us. "Mind if I watch, then?" he asked, his tone playful, but there was something else there, something beneath the surface that neither of us had ever acknowledged. I hesitated, the weight of his gaze settling over me. "I guess not," I replied, trying to keep my voice light, though my heart had begun to beat a little faster. He hopped over the fence with ease, landing gracefully beside me. "You know, you've got a talent for this," he remarked, kneeling down to examine one of the plants. His arm brushed against mine, and I froze for just a second, feeling the warmth of his skin through my thin shirt. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a charge in the air now, something electric that neither of us had the courage to address directly. We worked side by side in silence for a while, the tension building with every passing second. I could feel him glancing at me, watching the way I moved, and every time our hands accidentally brushed, a jolt of awareness shot through me. "You know," David said after a long pause, his voice softer now, "you spend a lot of time out here alone." I looked up at him, startled by the shift in his tone. "I like the quiet," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. He smiled, but it was a slow, knowing smile that made my pulse quicken. "It's peaceful," he agreed, his gaze lingering on my face for just a moment too long. "But sometimes don't you get tired of being alone?" There it was. The unspoken question that had hung between us for months, maybe longer. My breath caught in my throat, and I didn't know how to answer him. Instead, I focused on the dirt beneath my hands, the cool earth grounding me even as my thoughts began to spiral. "I'm not always alone," I said finally, my voice shaky. David didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out, his fingers grazing my arm, a light touch that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't have to pretend," he whispered, his voice low and intimate. "I've seen the way you look at me." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of everything I had tried to ignore. I wanted to pull away, to put distance between us, but I couldn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, craving the warmth of his hand against my skin. I started, but the lie died on my lips as his hand slid down my arm, his touch lingering, hesitant but deliberate. "You don't have to explain," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel it too." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sounds of the neighborhood faded into the background, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. David's hand moved to my wrist, his fingers brushing against the pulse there, and I felt my breath catch. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling, but I didn't pull away. He leaned in closer, his breath warm against my cheek. "Tell me to stop," he said softly, his lips so close to mine that I could feel the words against my skin. I should have. I knew I should have pushed him away, told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself closing the distance between us, my lips brushing against his in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative. But when he didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, becoming something more intense, more desperate. His hand slid at my arms, pulling me closer, and I felt a rush of heat flood my body. This was wrong. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. Not now. We broke apart, both of us breathing hard. And for a moment, we just stared at each other, the reality of what we had just done sinking in. I shouldn't have, I started, but David shook his head, his fingers still lingering on my skin. Don't, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Don't ruin this. I stared at him, my heart racing, torn between the desire to run and the desire to stay. My whole body was trembling, and I could feel the weight of what we had just done pressing down on me. But then David reached out again, his hand cupping my face, and all the uncertainty, all the guilt melted away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the lines we had just crossed. There was only him, and the way he made me feel. Alive, reckless, and desperate for more. David's thumb gently brushed my cheek, and the tenderness of his touch was in stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. My breath was shallow, my chest tight, and yet I couldn't bring myself to step away from him. His presence was magnetic, pulling me closer when every rational thought screamed at me to leave. I've wanted this for so long, he admitted, his voice soft, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. You have no idea. I swallowed hard, the weight of his confession crashing over me. How long had I ignored the signs? The lingering glances, the subtle touches, the way our conversations always seemed to carry an undertone of something more? My mind reeled, trying to piece together the moments that had led us here, to this fragile, forbidden place. I don't know what to say, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The truth was, I didn't know how to respond, not when I was still struggling with the emotions swirling inside me, desire, guilt, fear, all tangled together in a confusing knot. You don't have to say anything, David replied, his hand slipping down to my shoulder, his fingers tracing a path along my collarbone. I can see it in your eyes. His touch was intoxicating, and every time his fingers grazed my skin, I felt another surge of warmth spread through me. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the whirlwind of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me, but it was no use. His scent, his closeness, the heat of his body, it was all too much, and yet not enough. David, I breathed, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know what I was asking for, or if I was asking for anything at all. He moved closer, his lips brushing against the curve of my neck, and I shivered at the sensation. The softness of his kiss contrasted sharply with the urgency I could feel building between us, an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. I know this is complicated, he murmured, his breath warm against my skin. But you can't tell me you don't feel it too.
I did. God, I did.
The pull between us was undeniable, a force that had been building for months, maybe even longer, and now that the dam had broken, there was no way to hold back the flood of emotions crashing over me. But I couldn't stop thinking about the consequences. What this would mean for us, for our lives, for the delicate balance we had both maintained for so long. My mind screamed at me to be rational, to walk away before things went too far, but my body, my heart, had already made its decision. I turned to face him, my hands trembling as they reached for his. His eyes locked onto mine, searching, waiting for some kind of sign. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, I leaned in, pressing my lips to his in a kiss that was slow and deliberate, yet filled with the weight of everything we hadn't said. David responded immediately, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The kiss deepened, growing more intense, more urgent, and I felt myself melting into him, losing track of time, of where we were, of everything but the way he made me feel. His hands moved to my waist, guiding me back until I was leaning against the garden fence, and the world around us seemed to blur. There was nothing else but the heat between us, the feel of his body against mine, and the overwhelming desire that consumed us both. I shouldn't be doing this, I whispered between kisses, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. David's lips trailed along my jawline, down to the sensitive skin of my neck, and I gasped at the sensation. But you want this, he murmured, his voice low and rough with need. I couldn't deny it. I wanted him, more than I had ever allowed myself to admit, and now that I had tasted what it could be like, There was no going back. My hands tangled in his hair as his mouth continued its journey across my skin, each kiss sending a new wave of pleasure coursing through me. His touch was firm yet tender, guiding me deeper into the moment, and I found myself forgetting the reasons I had been so hesitant in the first place. His hand slipped under the hem of my shirt, his fingers brushing against my bare skin, and I shivered at the contact. It was as if every nerve in my body was suddenly alive, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath, every touch. The world around us had ceased to exist, and all that mattered was the way David's hands made me feel, wanted, needed, desired. I pulled him closer, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts as his kisses became more insistent, more desperate. There was no room for thought anymore, no space for hesitation. I had crossed a line, and now, all I could do was follow where it led. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. He pulled back just enough to meet my gaze, his dark eyes searching mine. "Tell me what you want," he said, his voice husky and filled with desire. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. But the truth was I already knew what I wanted. I wanted him. All of him. And I wasn't sure if I could ever go back. "Don't stop," I breathed, my voice barely audible. And just like that, the last barrier between us crumbled. David's hands moved to my hips, lifting me slightly, and I wrapped my legs around his waist as he pressed me against the fence. Our kisses grew frantic, filled with a need that neither of us could control, and I felt myself giving in completely, surrendering to the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. His lips found mine again, and the kiss was deep, almost possessive, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. His hands roamed my body, exploring every inch of skin with a tenderness that left me breathless. I knew we had crossed a line, one we could never uncross, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I could think about was how right it felt, how inevitable it had been. David's hands tightened around me as he pressed his body closer, every touch, every movement, stoking the fire that had been kindling between us for months. The heat of his breath mingled with mine, and my fingers dug into his shoulders as I clung to him, feeling the world fall away. The garden around us, the earth beneath our feet, the quiet of the late afternoon, it all faded into the background, leaving just the two of us tangled in a moment we had both been too afraid to acknowledge. The sound of his heartbeat, rapid and intense, pulsed against my chest, and I knew I was too far gone to stop this now. Our bodies moved together, instinctive and unguarded, as though every second we had held back made this moment all the more urgent, all the more necessary. My back pressed against the wooden slats of the fence, but I barely felt it. All I could focus on was the way David's lips moved over mine, the way his hands roamed my body with a mixture of passion and restraint. He was holding back, barely, but I could feel the strain, the way he was fighting to keep control. "Are you sure?" he whispered, his voice low and hoarse, his forehead resting against mine as his breath came in heavy gasps. I nodded, unable to find the words to express how much I wanted this, how much I needed it. There was no room for uncertainty anymore, no space for hesitation. I had made my choice, and now all I wanted was to give in to the desire that had been burning between us for so long. "Don't stop," I whispered again, and that was all the encouragement he needed. His hands slid down my sides, gripping my waist as he kissed me with a fierceness that left me breathless. I could feel the raw intensity of his desire, the way his body trembled with restraint as he tried to hold back. But I didn't want him to hold back. I wanted all of him, every touch, every kiss, every unspoken word between us. Our movements became more frantic, more desperate, as the last shreds of resistance fell away. David's lips found my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin there, and I gasped, my body arching into his touch. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the tension building between us, a coiled spring ready to snap. I pulled him closer, my hands fisting in his shirt as his kisses trailed lower, each one igniting a new wave of heat that spread through me like wildfire. His hands gripped my hips, pulling me against him with a need that mirrored my own, and I could feel the last of my defenses crumbling, swept away by the intensity of the moment. But then, just as the tension between us was about to break, David pulled back, his breathing ragged as he rested his forehead against mine. "Wait," he murmured, his voice strained. I blinked, confused, my body still humming with the need for him. "What's wrong?" He closed his eyes, his jaw clenched as if he was fighting some internal battle. We can't do this. Not like this." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean?" David pulled away slightly, his hands dropping to his sides as he took a step back. His eyes were filled with a mixture of desire and regret, and I could see the war he was waging with himself. "This isn't right," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're crossing a line that can't be undone." I felt a pang of guilt twist in my stomach, the weight of what we were doing crashing down on me like a tidal wave. He was right. We had crossed a line, and now we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything. But even as the rational part of my mind screamed at me to walk away, the rest of me, the part that had been yearning for this moment for so long, couldn't let go. I stepped closer to him, reaching for his hand. "David, I know this is complicated, but I don't want to stop. I don't want to pretend this doesn't mean anything." His eyes searched mine, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of unspoken feelings, until finally, he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if he had given up the fight. "I don't want to stop either," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But what happens after this? What are we supposed to do?" I didn't have an answer for him. The truth was, I didn't know what would happen after this, or how we would move forward. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go back to pretending that what I felt for him didn't exist. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I know I can't walk away from this." David's hand tightened around mine, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same struggle that was tearing me apart inside. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly. "I don't want to make things worse." "You're not," I assured him, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. "We'll figure it out. We'll take it one step at a time." He stared at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay." The relief that flooded through me was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that we had just crossed a line we could never uncross. There was no going back now, no pretending that this hadn't happened. David pulled me into his arms again, his embrace tight and comforting, and for a moment, we just stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the garden. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the lawn, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. "Whatever happens," David murmured into my hair, "I'm not letting you go." I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of his body against mine, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. But even as I clung to him, a small part of me couldn't shake the fear that we had just made a choice that would change everything, for better or for worse. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and stolen moments. David and I couldn't stay away from each other, but we also couldn't talk about what had happened without a cloud of uncertainty hanging over us. It was as if we had entered into a secret pact, one that neither of us fully understood, yet we were both unwilling to break. I tried to go about my routine as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Every time I stepped into my garden, I could feel the memory of David's touch, the weight of his body pressed against mine, the electric thrill of crossing a boundary we'd never expected to cross. And every time I saw him, whether it was passing each other in the yard or exchanging polite conversation with the neighbors, there was a tension between us that was impossible to ignore. It was on a Sunday afternoon, a week after that fateful kiss, when the tension finally boiled over again. I was kneeling by the hydrangeas, my hands working the soil, trying to keep my mind off the thoughts that had plagued me since that day. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the task at hand, I could feel David's presence nearby. I hadn't heard him approach, but I knew he was there before I even looked up. When I finally glanced over, he was standing just beyond the fence, watching me with the same intensity one had felt the first time. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the unspoken weight of everything between us hanging heavy in the air. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and serious. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "About what?" He stepped closer, his hands resting on the top of the fence. "About us." I straightened, brushing the dirt off my hands as I stood. My breath was shallow, and I could feel the anxiety building in my chest. I didn't know if I was ready to have this conversation, but I knew it was inevitable. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal when nothing felt normal anymore. "Okay," I said softly, crossing the garden toward him. David vaulted over the fence effortlessly, landing beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest, unsure of what he was going to say, unsure of what I wanted him to say. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted, his eyes locking onto mine. "Every day, every night. I can't get you out of my head." My breath caught, and I could feel my heart pounding even harder. I had been trying so hard to push those same thoughts away, but they clung to me, just as they clung to him. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I feel the same." David reached out, his fingers brushing my arm in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't know what to do," he said quietly, his voice filled with conflict. "I know this is wrong, but I can't stop wanting you." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I knew what he meant, and I felt it too. The guilt, the confusion, the desire that refused to fade no matter how hard we tried to deny it. We were playing with fire, and both of us knew it, but neither of us had the strength to walk away. "What if we don't stop?" I asked before I could think better of it. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt a rush of heat flood my face as soon as they left my lips. David's eyes darkened, and I could see the turmoil written across his features. "What do you mean?" I took a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I reached for his. "What if we just let this happen? What if we stop fighting it?" For a long moment, he didn't say anything. His grip tightened on my hands, his gaze intense and searching, as if he was trying to find some answer in my eyes. And then, slowly, he nodded. "We can't keep pretending," he said softly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But it's not going to be easy." I nodded, my heart racing. "I know." We stood there in the garden, the sun casting long shadows over the lawn as the evening crept closer, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The decision had been made. We had crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. David stepped closer, his hand cupping my face as he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was softer, more deliberate than the last time. It wasn't a frantic, desperate kiss of two people lost in the moment. This was something else, something deeper, more meaningful. It was a kiss that acknowledged the complexity of what we were doing, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, and yet the inevitability of it all. I melted into him, my arms wrapping around his neck as he pulled me closer. The warmth of his body against mine, the softness of his lips, the way his hands moved over me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. It was all too much, and yet, not enough. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered between kisses, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want to mess this up." I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "We'll figure it out," I said softly, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. "We'll take it slow." David nodded, though the look in his eyes told me he was just as uncertain as I was. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that we were together, that we had stopped pretending, stopped fighting what we both knew was inevitable. We spent the rest of the evening in the garden, stealing kisses and holding each other as the sun sank below the horizon. It felt like a dream, like something fragile and fleeting that we were both afraid would shatter if we held on too tightly. But as the night fell, reality began to creep back in. The world outside our little sanctuary was still waiting, with all its complications, all its consequences. And I knew, deep down, that the path we were on was dangerous. Still, I couldn't let him go. Not yet. Not when every part of me was screaming to hold on, to see where this would lead. I should go, David murmured after a long silence, though neither of us made a move to leave. I nodded, though my heart clenched at the thought of him walking away. Whatever happens next, he trailed off, his voice filled with uncertainty. I don't regret this. Neither do I whispered, my fingers lacing with his as I pressed one last kiss to his lips. He lingered for a moment longer, his hand cupping my cheek, before he finally stepped away, disappearing into the night. And as I stood alone in the garden, the cool breeze brushing against my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just set something in motion that neither of us could control. The days stretched on, and David and I continued to steal moments together, though the tension between us had shifted. We tried to keep things light, casual even, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of what we were doing. Every glance, every touch carried more meaning than it should, and we both knew that the more we let this continue, the harder it would be to pull away. We'd talk in whispers, mostly late at night when the world was quiet, sharing our thoughts and fears, but we never discussed what would happen if, or rather, when we were caught. There was a fragility to the bubble we had created around ourselves, a sense that it could pop at any moment, leaving us both exposed. One afternoon, David came over while I was working in the garden. It had become our unspoken meeting place, the only place where we could be together without suspicion. We exchanged small talk at first, discussing the flowers, the weather, anything to keep from acknowledging the growing storm inside us. But today was different. There was an edge to David, a restlessness I hadn't seen before. He seemed distant, distracted, and I could feel the shift in the air between us. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground could give way at any moment. Finally, after what felt like hours of dancing around the inevitable, David stopped, turning to face me with a look that made my heart stop. "We need to talk," he said, his voice tight. I froze, my hands stilling in the soil as I looked up at him. "About what?" He ran a hand through his hair, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "About this." "About us." I stood slowly, brushing the dirt off my hands, my heart racing. "What about us?" David sighed, stepping closer to me, his gaze intense. "This, whatever we're doing, it can't go on like this. We can't keep sneaking around, pretending everything is fine when it's not." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to make a choice," he replied, his voice filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "Either we end this now, before we hurt each other any more than we already have, or we take this seriously." My mind reeled, the weight of his words crashing over me. End it? Take it seriously? What did that even mean? My pulse quickened, fear and desire warring inside me. "I don't want to end it," I whispered, my voice trembling. David's eyes softened, and he reached out, his fingers brushing my arm. "Neither do I," he said quietly. "But we can't keep going like this, pretending that it doesn't matter. Because it does. It matters a lot." I stepped closer to him, my breath shaky. "What do you want, David?" He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I want you. I want us. But I don't know if we can have that without everything else falling apart." I felt a lump form in my throat, my chest aching with the weight of his words. He was right. We had been so focused on the desire between us that we hadn't stopped to think about what it would mean if we were discovered, if the carefully constructed walls of our lives came crashing down. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. David stared at me, his expression torn. "I don't know. I wish I did." We stood there, the silence stretching between us, and for the first time, I realized just how precarious our situation was. We had been so caught up in the whirlwind of emotions that we hadn't stopped to think about the consequences. "I don't want to lose you," I said finally, my voice shaking. "But I don't know how to make this work." David took a deep breath, his hand tightening around mine. "Maybe we can't. Maybe we're asking for too much." My heart sank at his words, the reality of what we had done crashing down on me like a wave. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, and now we were standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything we had built. But I don't regret it, he added softly, his eyes locking onto mine. Not for a second, tears filled my eyes, and I reached out, pulling him into a tight embrace. Neither do I whispered against his chest, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know what happens next. David held me close, his arms wrapped tightly around me, as if he was afraid to let go. Whatever happens, we'll face it together, he murmured. Even if it means saying goodbye. The words cut through me like a knife, and I felt the tears spill over, my heart breaking at the thought of losing him. But deep down, I knew he was right. We couldn't keep pretending that this was something simple, something that wouldn't have consequences. We had reached the end of the line, and now we had to face the reality of what we had done. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, wrapped in each other's arms, the garden around us bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a moment suspended in time, a fragile, fleeting connection that I knew would soon be broken. When we finally pulled apart, David cupped my face in his hands, his eyes filled with sadness. "I'll always care about you," he whispered, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. "But maybe this isn't our time." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond, my heart aching with the weight of his goodbye. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the fading light. I stood there, watching him go, my chest tight with the knowledge that we had reached the end of something beautiful and tragic. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the first cool breeze of the evening brush against my skin, and I realized that I was alone. Alone with the memory of a love that had burned too bright, too fast, and had left me standing in its ashes.